As the Second World War drew its final ragged breath, a new kind of darkness settled over the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. Here, in the final days, the very air was thick with the stillness of death. 13,000 unburied bodies lay scattered across the mud-caked grounds, while 60,000 more prisoners were left abandoned, hollowed out by starvation and disease. When British forces finally broke through the gates, the scene that met them defied comprehension. Yet amidst the chaos in the mountains of the dead, one discovery was particularly jarring: the women who had helped orchestrate this nightmare. Figures like Irma Grese, Elisabeth Volkenrath, and Johanna Bormann were not merely observers, they were the architects of brutality. They walked among the dying with an unnerving authority, their presence a chilling testament to a profound moral collapse. The question of how these women became the executioners of Belsen, seemingly devoid of remorse, would soon grip the public imagination. What followed in the courtroom would forever alter the world's understanding of the Holocaust's horror, forcing a confrontation with an evil that wore a human face. But for those who had witnessed their cruelty firsthand, a deeper question lingered. Could any earthly verdict ever truly account for the depths of their crimes? In the shadow of the Reich's collapse, a different kind of darkness festered. It was an architecture of abandonment, a system designed not for industrial murder, but for death by slow, deliberate neglect. Bergen-Belsen began its life in 1940 as a camp for prisoners of war, but its purpose twisted into something far more sinister when the SS assumed partial control 3 years later. Its sprawling grounds were carved into 3 distinct zones: a section for prisoners of war, a residential camp, and the main prisoner compound. This division allowed the Nazi administration to meticulously sort its victims by ethnicity, nationality, and political affiliation. Unlike the mechanized slaughter of Auschwitz, Belsen had no gas chambers. Its lethal mechanism was far more insidious. This mechanism of systematic negligence reached its dreadful peak from 1944 onward. Under the command of Josef Krummer, a man who would later be known as the Beast of Belsen, the camp's population swelled uncontrollably. In less than a year, the number of inmates multiplied tenfold, creating an environment where starvation and disease became the true executioners. Tuberculosis, typhus, and dysentery swept through the barracks like an unseen fire. In the final months before liberation, this planned abandonment reached its ghastly climax. A facility built for 10,000 souls was now suffocating with more than 60,000. Survivors spoke of a landscape where the line between life and death had dissolved entirely. The living, too weak to move, shared their bunks and floor space with corpses that had lain there for days, as the Nazi administration methodically choked off the last of the food rations. As British and Canadian forces closed in during April of 1945, Heinrich Himmler made a cold, pragmatic calculation. The camp would be surrendered without a fight. This was no act of mercy, but a stark admission of Germany's imminent defeat, a move to avoid a futile, final battle. On the 11th of April, a neutral zone was established around the camp, but what the Liberators found waiting defied all expectation. It was not just the scale of the horror, but the calm, continued presence of its architects. Among them was Kramer himself, along with numerous SS guards who claimed they were simply maintaining order. The grotesque irony of this statement became brutally clear as British soldiers stepped inside. They were met by a silent testament to chaos: more than 13,000 unburied bodies and nearly 60,000 prisoners in the last stages of life. The captives had been left for days without food or water, with 500 people dying each day. A BBC correspondent, his voice trembling with shock, broadcast the scene to the world. "Here, over an acre of land," he reported, "lie the dead and the dying. One cannot distinguish who is who." He described the living resting their heads against corpses, while a terrible, ghostly procession of the emaciated drifted aimlessly through the filth, unable to look away from the horrors that surrounded them. he witnessed impossible scenes of life and death entwined. A mother, driven mad by grief, screamed at a British sentry, begging for milk for her child. When he placed the small bundle in her arms, she ran off, crying terribly. He unwrapped the blanket, only to discover the baby had been dead for days. "This day at Belsen," he concluded, "was the most horrible of my life." The British reaction was immediate, though fraught with complexity. While medical teams began the monumental task of treating the survivors, SS guards were forced at gunpoint to bury the thousands of dead they had allowed to accumulate. But in the initial bedlam, justice was often swift and spontaneous. Some prisoners turned on their former torturers, even as some guards fired on inmates trying to reach the camp's food stores. With a typhus epidemic raging, the British were forced to take a drastic final measure. Survivors were moved to makeshift hospitals and disinfected, while the original camp, a pit of contagion, was systematically burned to the ground by flamethrower tanks. As the wooden barracks turned to ash, one inescapable question hung in the smoke. What kind of people could have orchestrated such an atrocity? The answer began to form as investigators identified some 500 people who had worked at Belsen. From this group, 45 guards and former employees were brought to trial between September and November of 1945. But what truly stunned the world was the discovery that among the accused were several young women whose names would become infamous for a cruelty that seemed to defy all comprehension. In the Reich's machinery of death, the gears were turned by more than just men. While the Nazi concentration camp system was built on a foundation of male authority, hundreds of women served as guards, becoming essential instruments in the mechanics of the Holocaust. Among them, 3 names would become whispers of terror: Irma Grese, Elisabeth Volkenrath, and Johanna Bormann, whose calculated cruelty would ultimately lead them to the gallows in December of 1945. Irma Grese was born into a large family in rural Germany in 1923. Her world fractured at the age of 13 when her mother, after discovering her husband's infidelity, committed suicide by swallowing hydrochloric acid. This profound trauma coincided with the rise of Nazism, which offered a seductive new system of values to a young girl adrift in emotional chaos. Before she was 15, Grese had left school, finding work as an auxiliary nurse in a sanatorium for SS soldiers. Though her father fiercely opposed her interest in the League of German Girls, the Nazi Party's youth organization, his rejection only hardened her resolve. She sought independence and belonging, deliberately turning her back on her family to find a new home within the Nazi system. Her ambitions soon found a path. Before turning 18, she was sent to Ravensbrück, a concentration camp exclusively for women. It was there, as a volunteer, that her transformation truly began, a detail that starkly contradicts any later claims of coercion. Ravensbrück was a training ground for female SS guards, and Grese adapted with chilling efficiency, her ideological conviction impressing her superiors. By 1942, at just 19 years old, she was promoted to supervisor, having fully absorbed the propaganda that painted National Socialism as Germany's only salvation. Elisabeth Volkenrath, born Elisabeth Mühlen, followed a different path into the darkness. The daughter of a forestry worker, she grew up in a large, unremarkable family. After her schooling, she worked as a nanny, a cook, and later a hairdresser. For her, there was no single traumatic event. Instead, her radicalization was a gradual seduction by the regime's promise of order and purpose in a turbulent world. In October of 1941, at the age of 22, Volkenrath voluntarily enlisted in the Female Auxiliary Corps of the SS. She was assigned to Ravensbrück under the command of Dorothea Binz, where she learned the cold techniques of surveillance and control. Like Grese, she consciously chose this path, requesting a transfer to Auschwitz in March of 1942, a camp that offered greater opportunity for those ambitious enough to climb the concentrationary hierarchy. Johanna Bormann presented a far different profile. Born in 1893, she was considerably older than her peers, entering the camp system at the age of 45 in 1938. Her youth belonged to a world before Nazism, and she had once harbored religious inclinations, even performing missionary work. This past piety stood in brutal opposition to the woman she would become. Bormann did not join the SS for ideological reasons, but for economic ones. She started as a civilian kitchen employee at Lüneburg, the first women's concentration camp, and was later moved to Ravensbrück. Though she was not molded by Nazi indoctrination from adolescence, she would develop a comparable brutality, proving how the system itself could transform individuals, even those whose lives were seemingly built on opposing values. The paths of these three women finally converged at Auschwitz-Birkenau in 1943. Grese, having impressed her superiors, was transferred there and rose quickly through the ranks. Upon learning of her work, her father severed all ties and threw her out of his home, a rupture that likely drove her deeper into the embrace of her SS identity, where she found power and a sense of belonging. Volkenrath also arrived at Auschwitz, first working in the prisoners' tailoring workshop before moving to the women's section of Birkenau. After contracting typhus, the very disease her prisoners suffered from, she ironically returned to supervise the office for packages and correspondence, a position giving her absolute control over vital resources. Bormann reached the camp in May of 1943, where her cruelty would find its ultimate expression. For all three, Auschwitz represented the apex of their participation in the Holocaust. They were no longer just guards. They were active participants in the selections, sending women and children directly to the gas chambers with a flick of a wrist. As the Red Army advanced in 1945, they were transferred to Bergen-Belsen, where their service continued under the command of Josef Kramer. In the camp's final, chaotic months, amid extreme overcrowding and raging epidemics, their brutality did not wane. It simply found new, more desperate forms of expression. The progression of these women through the camp system reveals how the Nazi regime normalized monstrous behavior, turning ordinary citizens into dedicated executioners. Their stories dismantle the notion that female participation in these crimes was merely peripheral or coerced. They chose their posts, clawed for promotions, and cultivated a personal brand of cruelty that distinguished them even in a system founded on dehumanization itself. In the suffocating air of the camps, cruelty was not merely a system, it was an art form, personalized by those who wielded it with a chilling intimacy. The sadism practiced by Irma Grese, Elisabeth Volkenrath, and Johanna Bormann went far beyond the routine brutality of the Nazi concentration camps. Their methods revealed a horrifying innovation in the administration of pain, a personal signature of cruelty that haunted thousands. They did not just follow orders, they refined them, turning systematic dehumanization into a deeply personal spectacle of suffering. Known to the prisoners as the hyena of Auschwitz, Irma Grese cultivated a repertoire of distinctive cruelties. Barely 20 years old, she seemed to derive a visible pleasure from the agony of others, combining raw physical violence with sharp psychological torment. During selections at Auschwitz-Birkenau, her gaze alone held the power of life and death, deciding who would be marched directly to the gas chambers. Survivors whispered it was jealousy that drove her to deliberately condemn beautiful women. Grese trained a German shepherd not just to guard, but to tear human flesh. Testimonies recount how she would unleash the animal on weakened women, watching with satisfaction as it mauled her victims. She complemented these attacks with her own beatings, using whips and steel-reinforced boots to inflict maximum damage. But her sadism had other, more intimate dimensions, as her absolute power over the prisoners bled into disturbing sexual dynamics, forcing some to serve the whims of herself and her SS lovers. Meanwhile, Elisabeth Volkenrath, as chief supervisor of the women's section, practiced a more methodical terror. A survivor named Vera Fischer testified that a beating from Volkenrath left her hospitalized for 3 weeks. Others witnessed her strike prisoners with a rubber baton until they lost consciousness on some 80 separate occasions. Her cruelty was calculated, designed for prolonged agony. The case of Helena Kopper reveals this cold deliberation. Accused of hiding a ring, she was forced to run behind a bicycle to SS headquarters, where Volkenrath beat her senseless. Locked in a basement and fed only bread and water every 3 days, she was later forced into latrine duty, where she inevitably contracted typhus. Volkenrath also implemented collective punishments she called sports, forcing malnourished women into exhausting exercises that often ended in death. Perhaps the most unsettling transformation was that of Johanna Bormann, known as the woman with the dogs. Once a religious woman, she developed a fascination with suffering that stood in stark opposition to her past. In the camps, her German shepherd became a living weapon, an extension of her own punitive will. During one death march, she unleashed the dog on a prisoner with an inflamed leg who could not keep pace. It tore the woman apart. Her collaboration with the infamous Josef Mengele, selecting prisoners for his experiments, placed her at the very heart of the camp's medical horrors. When these 3 women were transferred to Bergen-Belsen in early 1945, they entered a scene of utter catastrophe. 60,000 souls were crammed into a space built for 10,000, ravaged by epidemics of typhus and dysentery. In this new landscape of death, where starvation and disease were the primary killers, they simply adapted their methods. Grese continued to shoot prisoners arbitrarily, Volkenrath maintained her regime of lethal beatings, and Bormann's dog remained a tool of terror. A chilling aspect of their conduct was its persistence. As Allied forces closed in, many guards deserted their posts and fled. But Grese, Volkenrath, and Bormann remained, continuing their abuse until the moment of liberation, as if they could not bear to part with their power. This dedication suggested an identification with their roles that went far beyond mere obedience. Ultimately, their terror was psychological. They cultivated an atmosphere of constant, unpredictable fear. Grese would whistle softly as she walked the grounds, a gentle sound that signaled impending violence. Volkenrath wore an impassive, almost bored expression while delivering fatal beatings, a devastating contrast that shattered the psyche. Their actions were not just the implementation of policy, but a personal interpretation of horror, transforming them into architects of individualized suffering, each leaving her own unforgettable mark of atrocity. In the final desperate days of the war, an eerie quiet settled over Bergen-Belsen. It was a silence born not of peace, but of a strange and pragmatic negotiation. There would be no final desperate battle for this camp. On the 11th of April, 1945, Heinrich Himmler, staring into the abyss of Germany's defeat, authorized its unconditional surrender. This decision created a surreal tableau. As British and Canadian forces advanced, they found the SS guards, including Irma Grese, Elisabeth Volkenrath, and Johanna Bormann, still at their posts. They had not fled. They were waiting. When Allied officers established a neutral zone around the camp's perimeter, they were met by the commandant himself, Joseph Kramer, who claimed he had remained only to maintain order. His words were a grotesque fiction, spoken in a kingdom of absolute chaos. When the British fully entered on April 15th, what they found was a scene that defied the limits of human language. More than 13,000 unburied dead lay scattered across the grounds or piled high beside the barracks. Inside, some 60,000 prisoners existed in varying states of starvation and disease, many too weak to even move. With sanitation collapsed and epidemics of typhus and dysentery raging uncontrollably, the daily death toll had reached 500. In this apocalyptic landscape, identifying the female guards was not difficult. Survivors, summoning their last reserves of strength, immediately pointed out the 3 women, their voices choked with memories of unspeakable cruelty. Irma Grese, with her youthful and distinctive appearance, was recognized by countless prisoners. One survivor would later recall the face that smiled while deciding who lived and who died. Elisabeth Volkenrath shed her uniform for civilian clothes, a futile attempt to dissolve into the crowd of her victims, but she was quickly identified by women who remembered her from Auschwitz. Johanna Bormann, though less conspicuous, was betrayed by the memory of her trained dog, an instrument of her cruelty. The three women were taken into custody, along with 42 other members of the Belsen staff. The British command decided on a form of raw, immediate justice. The captured guards, men and women alike, were forced to take part in the burial of the thousands of corpses that littered the camp. It was a macabre task designed to force them into the tangible reality of their own work, to make them handle the direct results of their actions and their negligence. Surviving photographs freeze these moments in time. They show Irma Grese, her expression a mask of tension and defiance, carrying a body. Other images capture Elisabeth Volkenrath loading corpses into the vast pits dug by British bulldozers. The older Johanna Bormann is seen dragging human remains under the cold gaze of armed soldiers. Confronted directly with their crimes, their composure fractured in different ways. According to British soldiers, Grese remained defiant, handling the dead with a chilling disdain, as if they were inanimate objects. Volkenrath was physically overcome, vomiting during the work, while Bormann moved like an automaton, her face an impenetrable blank. These scenes were not just witnessed, they were recorded for the world. Journalists and military cameramen captured the perpetrators surrounded by the consequences of their crimes, creating some of the most enduring images of the Holocaust's end. The photographs circulated internationally, delivering a profound shock, challenging the public's assumption that such atrocities were exclusively the domain of men. BBC correspondent Richard Dimbleby voiced the deep dissonance of seeing young women who could have passed for nurses on any European street, now standing amid the proof of their indescribable acts. In the formal interrogations that followed, their defensive narratives began to solidify. Grese claimed she performed only administrative duties, while Volkenrath insisted she was unaware of the prisoner's ultimate fate. Bormann argued her dog was merely an untrained pet. These denials crumbled against the weight of survivor testimony, which painted a consistent and damning picture of their direct involvement. As the women were transferred to a military prison, the camp itself was condemned. British flamethrower tanks engulfed the barracks in fire, a final desperate act to cleanse the plague-ridden ground. The physical structure was gone, but the evidence remained, setting a powerful precedent. For the first time, female perpetrators would face international justice on the same terms as men, forever challenging simplistic notions about the nature of evil. In the solemn autumn of 1945, the quiet German town of Lüneburg became an unwilling stage for history. Between the 17th of September and the 17th of November, a British military tribunal convened for what would become known as the Belsen trial, a judicial process that would set a stark and unsettling precedent. For the first time, women would be systematically tried for crimes against humanity. The indictment against Commandant Joseph Kramer and 44 others was built upon two pillars of atrocity: crimes committed at Bergen-Belsen and those perpetrated at Auschwitz-Birkenau. This dual jurisdiction allowed the court to prosecute acts carried out on Polish soil, weaving a comprehensive tapestry of horror over 54 days of hearings. The most damning evidence arrived not as paper, but as light and shadow. Film recordings from the liberation of Belsen that unspooled before a stunned courtroom, revealing mountains of corpses and the skeletal survivors who haunted the grounds. This ghastly footage created a jarring dissonance with the three women in the dock, who presented themselves in neatly pressed uniforms, their faces masks of composure. Irma Grese, defended by Major LSW Cranfield, crafted a defense of partial denial, admitting to beating prisoners but refuting any role in the selections for the gas chambers. Her counsel attempted to paint her as a naive young woman, a cog corrupted by a monstrous machine. But this carefully constructed image would shatter under the weight of testimony. One survivor, Ilona Stein, stated with chilling clarity, "I personally saw Grese shoot a prisoner who was standing near the barbed wire." Another, Helen Copper, recounted how Grese had ordered her dog to savage inmates too weak to work. When confronted by the prosecutor, Colonel T.M. Backhouse, about beating a woman unconscious, Grese's reply was cold and absolute. Discipline had to be maintained. Elisabeth Volkenrath, represented by Captain A.H. Champion, pursued a similar strategy, claiming ignorance. She conceded her presence at the Auschwitz selections, but denied knowing their ghastly purpose. "I never knew about gas chambers," she declared, her words met with a ripple of disbelief from the survivors watching in the gallery. Her defense crumbled when Doris Safran described how Volkenrath had beaten an elderly woman to death for being unable to stand during a prolonged roll call, dragging her down a flight of stairs and kicking her motionless body. Johanna Bormann's defense, led by Major A. Monroe, leaned on her age and supposed powerlessness. She was portrayed as a solitary middle-aged woman trapped by circumstance, merely following orders. This characterization stood in stark contrast to survivor accounts of her ordering her German Shepherd to tear prisoners apart. In her own testimony, Bormann admitted to owning a dog but insisted she never used it against prisoners, absurdly claiming it was against camp regulations. Gathering such testimony was a monumental task. Many key witnesses were scattered across a healing Europe, while others had already succumbed to the lingering effects of their imprisonment. Despite these hurdles, the British prosecution assembled 54 witnesses whose accounts formed a consistent, detailed, and undeniable record of the accused women's actions. The international press followed the proceedings with a morbid fascination, particularly fixated on Irma Grese. The British Daily Express dubbed her the "beautiful beast," capturing the public's struggle to reconcile her youth and appearance with the systematic cruelty she embodied. While male brutality was understood within the grim paradigms of war, the sight of female perpetrators challenged deeply ingrained notions of femininity, shattering long-held beliefs about a woman's capacity for evil. On the 16th of November, 1945, the court delivered its verdicts. Irma Grese and Elisabeth Volkenrath were found guilty of crimes at both Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. Johanna Bormann was convicted for her actions at Auschwitz alone, a finding still sufficient to warrant the maximum penalty. The sentences were pronounced the next day. Josef Kramer and 10 of his subordinates, including the 3 women, were condemned to death by hanging. Their reactions in that final moment were telling. Official reports noted Irma Grese remained defiant, showing no remorse. Elisabeth Volkenrath seemed to receive the news with stunned disbelief, while Johanna Bormann, according to one observer, appeared to retreat into a trance. Grese's last-minute appeal for a new trial was swiftly dismissed, sealing her fate. The Belsen trial had etched a new line in the annals of international justice. Gender would offer no shield from accountability. For these 3 women, their final appointment was set, a meeting with the hangman at Hamelin Prison. The old prison at Hamelin, its stones steeped in a grim quiet, was about to become a stage for an unprecedented act of justice. Within its walls on the 13th of December, 1945, 3 women convicted of crimes against humanity would meet their end at the gallows, a final reckoning for the beasts of the Reich. For this task, the British authorities had prepared a special block, a stark corridor of small cells leading to a single execution chamber. To carry out the sentences handed down at the Belsen trials, the British Crown summoned its official executioner, Albert Pierpoint. A man renowned for his professionalism and quiet efficiency, Pierpoint had traveled to Germany to oversee the proceedings. He would employ the long drop hanging method, a British technique designed to cause instantaneous death through cervical fracture, a science intended to minimize suffering. This required precise calculations, a grim arithmetic based on the weight and build of each condemned soul. The day before, Pierpoint and his assistant met the prisoners to take their measurements. The encounter with Irma Grese, later documented in Pierpoint's autobiography, was particularly unsettling. As she walked from her cell, she was laughing, a young woman who looked, as he wrote, as healthy as anyone could wish to know. When asked her age, she paused and smiled, a moment of conventional shyness that Pierpoint and his assistant found themselves returning. Finally, she answered, 21. This disquieting display of normality from a woman on the eve of her execution was a chilling prelude to the cold facts. Pierpoint meticulously recorded her height at 165 centimeters and her weight at 68 kilograms. From these figures, he calculated that a drop of 2¼ meters would be required to ensure her death was instantaneous. The brief human moment had passed, replaced by the stark mechanics of the gallows. Elisabeth Volkenrath's meeting was a far more sober affair. She offered no joviality, answering questions in monosyllables while her gaze remained fixed on the floor. Her measurements were taken, her drop calculated, and she was returned to her cell, a silent figure receding into the shadows of the prison corridor. Johanna Bormann, however, presented a stark contrast to her younger, more composed companions. At 52 years old, she was visibly older and more haggard, limping down the corridor with a palpable sense of dread. Pierpoint noted that she trembled as she stepped onto the scales. In a quiet voice, she spoke a single sentence in German, the only one he recorded from her. "I have my feelings." It was a rare crack in the facade of a woman who had shown so little mercy, a fleeting glimpse of the human vulnerability she now faced. The morning of December 13th began with cold precision. 11 people were scheduled to die, with the 3 women to be executed individually first, a decision possibly made to spare them the agonizing wait. At 9:34, Irma Grese became the first to face the hangman. Pierpoint recalled the moment with technical clarity, the German officer flinging open the corridor door, the row of faces watching from their cells, the audible sigh of released tension in the execution chamber. He called her name, Irma Grese. She emerged from her cell, too small for him to enter, and he had to secure her in the corridor itself. Following his command, she walked to the chamber, glanced at the assembled officers, and stepped onto the chalk mark at the center of the trap door. As Pierpoint placed the white hood over her head, she spoke one final languid word. Schnell. Quick. The trapdoor fell, and a doctor pronounced her dead in the pit below. Her last utterance has been interpreted as defiance, resignation, or even a strange consideration for her executioners. Whatever the intent, it was the final statement of a life marked by extraordinary cruelty. At 10:04, Elisabeth Volkenrath followed the same path. Silent and composed, she offered no final words before the trap door opened, ending the life of a woman who had risen from hairdresser to camp supervisor in less than a decade. The last of the women, Johanna Bormann, was led to the gallows at 10:38. Physically weakened, she required assistance to climb the scaffold steps. The protocol was followed without deviation, and after her death was confirmed, her body was removed. The way was now clear for the execution of the male prisoners, beginning with Joseph Kramer, the Beast of Belsen, who was hanged alongside Dr. Fritz Klein just after noon. The remaining men followed in pairs until all 11 sentences were carried out. Once confirmed dead, the bodies were placed in simple coffins and cremated. British authorities, wary of creating martyrs, ordered that no graves should exist that might become pilgrimage sites for Nazi sympathizers. The ashes were scattered in an undisclosed location, a final act of erasure. Pierpoint's dispassionate professionalism had set a standard for international justice, underscoring the principle that the proceedings were about law, not vengeance. Among Irma Grese's personal effects, authorities found a bank book with a balance of over 4,000 Reichsmarks, a fortune for the time. It was stark evidence of the material rewards she had reaped from her position of power. At just 22, she became the youngest woman executed under British law in the 20th century, and the 3 women together were the only ones executed by Great Britain in all the post-war trials. The justice administered in Hamelin that day was more than individual retribution. It solidified an emerging principle in international law. The participation in crimes against humanity carries personal responsibility, regardless of gender or rank. For the survivors of Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, these executions were not just punishment for their tormentors, but a formal, terrible recognition of the suffering they had endured. In the cold aftermath of judgment, the gallows cast long shadows, but true accountability remained fragmented and elusive. The executions of Irma Grese, Elisabeth Volkenrath, and Johanna Bormann were a stark public spectacle, yet these three women were merely cogs in a vast machinery of death. On that same 13th of December in 1945, within the walls of Hamelin Prison, the hangman Albert Pierre Point would end the lives of 8 men from the Belsen trials, bringing the day's grim tally to 11. At the head of this procession to the gallows was Joseph Kramer, the man known across the world as the Beast of Belsen. Born in Munich to a middle-class Catholic family, Kramer was the very model of a bureaucrat transformed into a monster of industrial slaughter. His career was a map of the concentration camp system's escalating horror, joining the Nazi Party in 1931 and the SS a year later. From a guard at Dachau, he ascended through positions of authority at Sachsenhausen and Mauthausen, eventually serving as an assistant to Rudolf Höss at Auschwitz. His own command finally came at Natzweiler-Struthof, a camp on French soil. There, Kramer personally gassed 80 Jewish prisoners selected for a grotesque collection of skeletons at the Reich University in Strasbourg. In his own testimony, he admitted to this direct participation, describing with chilling detachment how his victims gasped for roughly half a minute before the gas took hold. His was not the work of a distant administrator, but the hands-on practice of murder. In May of 1944, Kramer was sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau as operations commander, where he presided over the murder of tens of thousands. His final transfer to Bergen-Belsen that December coincided with the camp's complete administrative collapse. As the prisoner population swelled from 7,300 to over 60,000, he oversaw conditions that led to between 250 and 300 deaths each day from starvation and disease alone. During his trial, Kramer attempted to portray himself as a simple functionary, overwhelmed by circumstances beyond his control. This carefully constructed facade shattered under the weight of testimony, revealing he had personally executed prisoners for the smallest infractions. Just days before liberation, he shot 2 Russian inmates for scavenging rotten potatoes. At 12:19 in the afternoon, his life ended alongside that of Dr. Fritz Klein. Fritz Klein represented the utter perversion of medicine in service to genocide. Born in what is now central Romania, he studied medicine in Budapest and served as a military doctor in the First World War. In 1943, as an ethnic German, he was conscripted into the Waffen-SS. By December, he was the camp doctor at Auschwitz, first for the women's section at Birkenau, then for the so-called gypsy and family camps. His primary duty was performing selections, deciding with a flick of his wrist who would live and who would be sent to the gas chambers. He admitted to this role, stating he was ordered to separate those fit for work from those who were not. But his moral decay was laid bare in a single, monstrous declaration. "My Hippocratic oath," he claimed, "tells me to cut a gangrenous appendix from the human body. The Jews are the gangrenous appendix of humanity." With these words, he revealed how the ethics of healing had been twisted into a justification for mass murder. Following Kramer and Klein to the gallows was Franz Hössler, who had traced a similar path through the camp system. Starting as a guard and cook at Dachau, he was transferred to Auschwitz in 1940, where he oversaw the execution of hundreds. As supervisor of the women's camp at Birkenau, Hössler perfected a cruel theater of deception, calmly reassuring new arrivals destined for immediate death. He would tell them this was a work camp, that they would be cared for, that well-paid work awaited. This calculated speech, uttered moments before they were gassed, exposed the deep psychological cruelty of the entire operation. Others represented complicity at every level. Karl Franzio and Ansgar Pichen, both cooks for the SS at Bergen-Belsen, were convicted of shooting prisoners who desperately tried to gather scraps of food. Wilhelm Dürr, just 24 years old, embodied the radicalization of an entire generation, supervising a death march where he personally shot those too weak to continue. His superior, Franz Stoffel, shared responsibility, his claims of adequate rations dissolving against survivor accounts of systematic starvation and summary execution. These 8 men, executed alongside the 3 women, were the faces of a multifaceted system: the administrator, the doctor, the supervisor, the logistician. Their sentences, however, were not the final word. 19 other accused received prison terms from 1 year to life. Women like Hertha Ehlert and Hilda Lisevich received 15 and 10 years respectively. Hertha Botha, known for savage beatings, was also sentenced to 10 years but was released by 1951. This disparity in sentencing fueled a bitter debate. Direct evidence of murder often meant the gallows, while acts of brutality without documented deaths led to prison. For survivors like Eva Olsen, the logic was incomprehensible. She had seen Bothe beat a woman nearly to death. Why, she asked, should she deserve to live when so many innocents died? The early releases of the 1950s, driven by the shifting priorities of the Cold War, felt to many like a second betrayal. The executions at Hamelin were only the most visible layer of responsibility. Hundreds of guards and staff escaped, vanishing in the chaos of the war's end, while others faced separate, uneven trials. This judicial fragmentation meant that justice for the Holocaust would be, by its very nature, incomplete. Even so, the events of December 13, 1945, marked a watershed moment. For the first time, individuals were being held to account for crimes against humanity on an international stage,